Well, welcome everyone. Tonight's talk is going to be, I think, very interesting. It's about a person that's not very well known. His name was Mai Her Pri, the Nubian in the Valley of the Kings. Before Ramses the Great, before Seti I, and before Tutankhamun, Mai Her Pri was laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings. His was the first almost intact tomb discovered in the valley, and its occupant was quite unique. My story begins with this gentleman, Victor Loret, a student of Gaston Maspero. In 1881, when he was 22 years of age, he joined a French team excavating in Egypt. In 1886, he became director of the French Institute in Egypt. And then, after De Morgan resigned as Antiquities director in 1887, Loret was appointed director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. Although trained as an epigrapher and not as an archaeologist, Loret immediately began excavating in the Valley of the Kings. The valley had not been dug since the time of Belzoni, so it was long overdue for discoveries. Loret began work in 1898, and in his first year he discovered KV 32, the tomb of Tiaa, the wife of Amenhotep II. And soon after he found KV 33, the tomb of an anonymous non-royal person. Then he made the significant find of KV 34, the tomb of Thutmose III. And at the end of his season, he discovered KV 35, the tomb of Thutmose's son, Amenhotep II, with its cache of royal mummies. His 1898 discoveries are shown on the map with blue circles. When work resumed in 1899, Loret discovered KV 36, the 18th dynasty tomb of Mai Her Pri, the first non-royal intact burial found in the valley. Later that same season, he found anonymous tomb KV 37, KV 38, the second tomb of Thutmose I, and anonymous tombs KV 39, 40, and 41. His final discovery that year was KV 42, probably the tomb of Mariettre, wife of Thutmose III. His 1899 discoveries are shown with yellow circles on this map. So as you can see, 1898 and 99 were very busy years for Loret. And even though it's called the Valley of the Kings, only 21 of its 63 tombs have been identified as the burial places of Egypt's pharaohs. The circumstances are not known, but in 1899, soon after his discovery of KV 41, Loret was fired from the Antiquities Service, and he returned to France. Flinders Petrie remarked that Loret was out of touch and disliked by everyone, and Emile Bruges added, De Morgan was a small devil, but Loret is 20 devils. No doubt Loret's dismissal was the reason he never published any of his excavations. However, using Loret's field notes, later Egyptologists eventually published several of the tombs he had discovered. Loret's mentor, Gaston Maspero, returned to Egypt to replace him. Maspero then led the Antiquities Service from 1899 until 1914, but I'll save that story for a future talk. Loret discovered Mai Her Pri's tomb, KV 36, on the 3rd of March, 1899. Although Flinders Petrie criticized Loret's method of digging random pits in the valley, Loret was quite successful, locating 10 tombs in the valley in only 2 years. Situated at the beginning of the Wadi, leading to Thutmose III's tomb, KV 36 is entered by a 26-foot deep vertical shaft, which leads to a 16 by 16-foot burial chamber. We still don't know for sure which pharaoh was ruling during Mai Her Pri's lifetime, but I'll discuss that later. After his team cleared away most of the debris blocking the entrance, Loret was lowered down by ropes to see what was inside, and he found wonderful things. Loret immediately noticed a large black sarcophagus near the right wall and a canopic chest sitting beside it. There was also an empty coffin in the middle of the room with its lid upside down next to it. Burial goods were scattered around the tomb, evidence that the tomb had been entered and robbed at some point in the past. Loret feared the mummy had been stolen. On the sarcophagus, the tomb owner was named Mai Her Pri, a noble of the royal court. His name means lion on the battlefield. This is Mai Her Pri's large wooden sarcophagus. It's coated in black bitumen and embellished with gold foil images and hieroglyphs. On closer inspection, Loret saw it looked intact, that did not appear to have been broken into. The sarcophagus is over 9 feet long, and it was originally flanked by 13 large pottery jars. However, unlike similar sarcophagi found later, Mai Her Pri's sarcophagus was not mounted on a sled. And for your information, the ancient Egyptian word for sarcophagus is Neb-Ankh, literally Lord of Life. I find that interesting. On the side of the sarcophagus was a depiction of the goddess Nephthys. An inscription begins which wraps around onto the other side. It says, quote, "Words spoken by the fan-bearer Mai Her Pri. May the mother Nut drop blessings upon me. You are given to be like the imperishable star, so I shall never die," end quote. And Nut replies, quote, "Honored before Horus and the four sons of Horus, Hapi, Kebe-Senu, Imseti, and Duamatef. Honored before Geb and Anubis, the foremost of the divine and the one who is in his embalming tent, the fan-bearer Mai Her Pri, true of voice," end quote. True of voice or justified means that the deceased was judged to have answered truthfully when his heart was weighed against the feather of truth to see if he should be allowed to enter the afterlife. Here's Mai Her Pri's name and one of his titles as seen on his sarcophagus: Fan, Bearer of the King, the Noble, True of Voice, Mai Her Pri, Lion on the Battlefield. Mai Her Pri is the first person we know of that held that title, Fan Bearer. Inscriptions on his grave goods show three variations of this title: Fan Bearer of the King, Fan Bearer of the Lord of the Two Lands, and Fan Bearer on the right side of the king. It was an important title because the fan bearer often accompanied the king, and he was allowed to be physically very close to him. This slide shows a couple of officials who later held the same title, and they're both holding ostrich feather fans. Ostrich feather fans were a symbol of Ma'at, the goddess of cosmic order. Nubians were also known for wearing ostrich feathers in their hair, and Nubian delegations often presented ostrich feathers as gifts to Pharaoh. So it's appropriate that Mai Her Pri, a Nubian, may have been the first person to hold that fan bearer title. Mai Her Pri's other title listed on his coffin was Child of the Kop. As I'll explain later, this important title may help identify Mai Her Pri's pharaoh. The Kop was the royal nursery, where children of the king were raised in the queen's harem palace. Children who were raised and educated there included the royal offspring, the children of relatives, and the children of other companions of the king. Rosalind Jansen said in her book, Growing Up in Ancient Egypt, quote, "During the 18th dynasty, several members of the upper classes boasted that they were children of the Kop. Children taken into it became pages in the medieval sense," end quote. Medieval pages and squires were attendants to noblemen who ran messages, organized and cleaned weapons, and learned the art of combat. Jansen continues, "It was a position which one was as proud of as the famous public schools in Britain. Child of the Kop was one of ancient Egypt's most honorable titles. During the New Kingdom, these boys were educated at court among the royal princes. As companions of the king's sons, they were destined to play influential roles in the government," end quote. About 40 such boys are known from the 18th dynasty, after which the Child of the Kop title seems to have disappeared. Interesting text in the tomb of Heka-Ernehey, TT 64, says the tomb owner was a child of the Kop, and he later became tutor of Thutmose IV. Heka-Ernehey's father, Heka-Reshu, who's shown here, wrote in his tomb that he was also a tutor of Amenhotep II and 3 other princes. Even more interesting is that the first part of their names, Heka, which means ruler, suggests the 2 Hekas may have been princes of Nubian descent. Royal tutors, Mene-Nesut in ancient Egypt, were responsible for training the royal princes, one of which was destined to be the next king. The scene in the top right shows Min, another tutor to Amenhotep II, teaching him archery. These tutors taught the children of the Kop military training, including archery, chariot driving, and physical combat. Khnum was the royal steward of Amenhotep II, and he was raised in the Kop with the king. Khnum's mother, Amenhotep, is shown here on the right with Amenhotep II. She was the wet nurse of the future king. George Swinefirth called these children of the Kop milk brothers of the king. And I'll explain Swinefirth's connection to Mai Her Pri in a couple of minutes. Here's the empty coffin that was found in the center of Mai Her Pri's tomb, its lid cast off to one side and upside down. The coffin is 7 foot 2 inches long, made of cedar wood, and has inlaid eyes of black and white jasper. It was constructed in an early style, with wadjet eyes placed at both shoulders. The face, headdress, gods, and bands had all been gilded, but bare wood in between the bands suggests the black bitumen was intended to be added before it was used. Perhaps this coffin was originally intended to be used alone, or the plan was changed to use this coffin in a nested set inside the sarcophagus. But then they found out this middle coffin was too small to contain the inner coffin, and instead it was left beside the sarcophagus unused. The unused coffin is inscribed, and I quote, "An offering for you was given by the king to Osiris, the foremost of the West, the great god, the ruler of eternity. He gave bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, clothes, a libation of wine and milk, and every good and pure thing, guided by the pleasant breath of the northern wind. You will be allowed to wash your face in the water of the river, Ka of the fan-bearer Mai Her Pri, true of voice, justified before the great God, the Lord of the land." That's end quote. And it goes on to praise the gods Osiris, Anubis, and the four sons of Horus. By the way, the Ka was one of the 8 parts the Egyptians believed made up the soul. It represented the life force inhabiting the living. When Loret opened the large black sarcophagus, he discovered a black coffin inside, 8 foot 4 inches long and made of cedar wood. It has gilded decoration and inscriptions. The figure on the lid has eyes of inlaid black and white jasper and is depicted with a bead necklace and bracelets on its crossed hands. Loret stated it did not appear to have been tampered with. This outer coffin is inscribed, quote, "An offering was given for you by the king to Osiris, the lord of Abusir, the great god and lord of Abydos. He gave an offering of bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, clothes, incense, fire, ointment, and every good and pure thing to the Ka of the fan-bearer Mai Her Pri, child of the Ka and true of voice," end quote. Inside the black outer coffin was still another inner coffin, also made of cedar wood. It too was intact, and it contained the mummy of a man. Unusually, the face on the inner coffin has a braided beard, normally a symbol reserved for the king. Like the outer coffin, the figure on the lid has crossed hands. This coffin was made of 32 planks of wood, covered with a thin layer of plaster and engraved. The eyes were made of black and white jasper, and the entire coffin was gilded, both inside and out. A Wadjet eye placed on top of a monument is depicted on either shoulder. The inscription on the inner coffin, the one containing Mai Her Pri's mummy, says, quote, "An offering was given for you by the king to Osiris, the great god and ruler of eternity. Bread, beer, oxen, etc., given like the sun gives every day to the Ka of the fan-bearer Mai Her Pri, true of voice," end quote. And the text continues with the usual honors to the gods I previously mentioned. Mai Her Pri's mummy was intact and fully wrapped. It was adorned with a beautiful gilded mummy mask. The interior of the mask was coated in black bitumen. The eyes are also made of black and white jasper. The mummy mask was either made for another person, or possibly at that time it was not considered necessary the face on the mask resemble the deceased. Beside the sarcophagus was a cedar wood canopic box containing these canopic jars. These jars contained the dried inner organs of the deceased. In the New Kingdom, royal canopic chests were mainly made of stone, but non-royal burials, like Mai Her Pri, are usually made of wood. Mai Her Pri's chest was mounted on sled rails, perhaps to make it easier to transport. On the canopic box, first side above Nephthys on the left, it says, quote, "Words spoken by Nephthys. Embraced with 2 arms, Hapi gives his protection," end quote. On the right side above Isis, it says, quote, "Words spoken by Isis. Embraced with 2 arms, Imseti gives his protection," end quote. And on the opposite side of the box, Neith and Selket pledge the protection of the final 2 sons of Horus, Gebel-Senu and Duamatef. And on the remaining 2 sides also have figures depicting the 4 sons of Horus, who also honor Mai Her Pri. The lid on the canopic box has the shape of an archaic shrine of Upper Egypt called the Per Wer. The top of the box is fitted with a corvetto cornice, covered with alternating black and gold stripes. The lid was fastened by tying a rope around 2 wooden knobs, one on the lid and the other on the box's side. The rope was probably secured with a clay seal, stamped with the emblem of the necropolis, the jackal and 9 captives, as shown here on Tuya's canopic box. Inside the chest were Mai Her Pri's alabaster canopic jars, 11 inches high and 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Unlike later jars that portray the 4 sons of Horus, Mai Her Pri's jars were all human-headed. The jars were wrapped in linen, probably to provide physical safekeeping while being transported, and to provide magical protection, as linen mummy wrappings were under the protection of the goddess Nephthys. On each jar, one of the four goddesses, Isis, Selket, Nephthys, and Neith, pledged the respective sons of Horus would protect the deceased, Mai Her Pri. The inscriptions on the jars in the canopic chest are inspired by chapter 152 of the Book of the Dead, the spell for building a cult place on Earth. One of Loret's most important finds was a papyrus rolled up next to the canopic box. It had vignettes with pictures of a dark-skinned man with curly black hair. He did not look like a typical Egyptian. 2 years after the discovery of tomb KV36, on March the 22nd, 1901, Mai Her Pri's mummy was unwrapped at the Cairo Museum. His well-preserved body did not have any wounds or apparent cause of death, and it was evident he was of Nubian origin. He was about 5 foot 5 inches in height, of slender build, and between 25 and 30 years of age when he died. He had been wrapped with several amulets, and the remains of gold sandals were found on his feet. His ears were pierced, and his curly black hair was a wig. Dennis Forbes observed that he had the typical Thutmose overbite, indicating perhaps that he was of mixed race, and possibly was the son or half-brother of one of the Thutmose kings, like Thutmose III. Here's a facial reconstruction done by an artist to determine what Mai Her Pri might have looked like. The objects found in Mai Her Pri's mummy were, under his head were 2 bracelets, under his neck was a necklace, 2 long glass beads were found in linen wrapped on his chest, under his left armpit was a bundle of germinated barley, between his left arm and his chest was a gold ring, half a bracelet was found under his kidneys, the incision plate had fallen into the opening made in his left flank, a scarab was found at the bottom of the coffin, on the right wrist were beads originally strung with a leather thread. They're the other half of that bracelet I previously mentioned. And the flat part of a golden sandal was found on his right instep. Under each foot was a small cloth containing resin and vegetable debris. In 2004, Italian Egyptologist Christian Orsanego found some of Loret's excavation notes in archival storage in Paris, Milan, and Cairo. He subsequently published this diagram of the principal things found in Mai Her Pri's tomb. Now, I've already discussed the sarcophagus, the coffins, the canopic chest, the jars, and the mummy. But now let's take a look at some of the other items found in the tomb. In 1899, the contents of Mai Her Pri's tomb were transferred to Cairo, where they were cataloged and photographed by museum employee Egyptologist George Deresi. At that time, the Egyptian Museum, shown in the top picture, was located at Giza. The objects were moved again by Deresi in 1901 to their new home at the Egyptian Museum at Tahrir Square, seen in the bottom photo. Here's a partial list of the several hundred items found in Mai Her Pri's tomb, as cataloged by Deresi. And here's some more. Over 70 arrows were found among his grave goods. Many of these objects are on display in room 17 on the upper floor at the Cairo Museum at Tahrir Square, in cases 3800 to 3823. Now, I notice that these objects are still being displayed with their JDE, or Journal d'Entrée, numbers, which were assigned to them when they first arrived at the Giza Museum in 1899. When they were moved to the Tahrir Square Museum, they were recatalogued under the CG, or Catalogue General system, by which they are referenced today. And that shows just how long these artifacts have been stored in their display cases and never updated, over 121 years. George Schweinfurth was a German botanist and African explorer. He assisted Loret in the investigation and clearance of KV36. Schweinfurth wrote and published an article about his work examining Mai Her Pri's tomb in the French publication, whose name translated into English is Sphinx, Critical Review Embracing the Entire Domain of Egyptology. It was published from 1897 to 1930. I used Google Translate to read Schweinfurth's article, which was written in German, and I'll quote from it as I describe the contents of Mai Her Pri's tomb. Mai Her Pri was buried with arrows, a quiver, and wrist guards. Schweinfurth wrote, quote, "Strange weapons have been brought to light from this burial chamber. There were found 2 quivers made of intricately worked leather, containing some 50 arrows, some tipped with hardwood, the others studded with rows of inserted splinters of stone. One of the quivers is made of yellow pressed leather and printed with Asiatic-style ornaments. The other, made of pink leather, offers multicolored mosaic designs composed of pieces of letter of different colors, end quote. Catherine Roehrig from the Metropolitan Museum of New York confirms the quivers have definite Asiatic decoration. Perhaps they were brought back from a campaign in the Levant. Here are their ancient Egyptian names. Now, the bow on the left was found in Amenhotep II's tomb by Loret. There were no bows in Mai Her Pri's tomb, as they were probably stolen when his tomb was ransacked. Also note the caps on the quivers. I'll say more about this in a couple of minutes. Mai Her Pri's arrows are similar to the arrows found in a New Kingdom tomb at Dra Abu al-Naga, which have been studied and published. Those arrows are around 32 inches long and were manufactured in two parts, a shorter ebony wood foreshaft and a longer main shaft made of reeds. The reed main shaft is about 25 inches long, and it's notched and fitted with guide vanes for 3 feathers, and then the notch and feathers are wrapped in twine dipped in glue to strengthen them. The feathers, though, have not survived on these arrows. The two sections of reed and wood are then deeply set into each other and joined with twine dipped in glue. You can see the lighter main shafts on the arrows in the right-hand picture. I put red circles where the section joins are. The wooden foreshaft is then fitted with a stone tip wrapped in twine and glued. They're called composite arrows. Here's the tips of some of the arrows from the previous slide. In the left-hand picture, arrow number 2 is a simple sharpened wooden point, but the others have razor-sharp stone microliths, the details of which are shown in the right photo. And arrow number 5 contains 2 barbs set in an X pattern. Perhaps one of the reasons Nubian archers were so successful is that analysis of arrows from Nubia show they were dipped in poison from the Calotropis procera, a native plant of the milkweed family that grew along the banks of the Nile in Nubia. An extract from this plant, calotropin, is a powerful heart poison. It's made from crushed calotropis seeds mixed with the juice of euphorbia, which is an irritant that causes the victim to scratch the wounded area and hasten the effects of the poison. Death usually occurs within 4 hours. This probably explains why Mai Her Pri's quivers came with caps. Archers would not want to scratch themselves with the tip of a poisoned arrow while carrying them. Here's another fascinating object found in Mai Her Pri's tomb. His Osiris bed was the first ever found in Egypt. Constructed on a wooden frame of cross sticks placed on a wooden stand, it was covered with a thick papyrus mat. On top of the mat was stretched a cover of 3 layers of linen cloth, coated with some substance to make it watertight. In the center of the bed was a black painted outline of Osiris. Covered with dirt, was sprinkled with barley seeds, watered and allowed to sprout and grow. Schweinfurth commented, quote, "The barley had germinated and sprouted forth some 3 inches high. It looked like a lawn in the shape of Osiris, and although it had long since yellowed, it remained undamaged. It was truly an original version of the idea of resurrection. Osiris, who had risen to new life under the image of the germinating barley, was to draw the mortal shell of the dead person to godlike immortality." End quote. Pretty profound. The Osiris bed ceremony was part of the ancient Egyptian festival of Ka Her Ka, or sustenance upon sustenance, celebrated in the 4th month of the flood season, Akhet. It's sometimes called the Koiak Festival, after the Coptic name of the month it was celebrated, from mid-September to mid-October in our calendar. After the Osiris-shaped bed was built and planted with seeds, it was watered each day for 3 weeks, and then the watering stopped and the sprouts allowed to die. Then a shroud was placed over the figure, and spells recited to ensure the deceased is reborn in the next world. This drawing is from a scene at Dendera, where Isis and Nephthys recite the words of coffin text spell 269, the formula to become barley, and spell 330, the formula to personify the grain. Horus, symbolized as a hawk, is bringing a fan to blow air into the nostrils of the resurrecting Osiris, whose canopic jars are protected by the 4 sons of Horus under his bed. Mai Her Pri's blue faience bowl has scenes of a nursing gazelle and 3 bolty fish. Bolty fish, by the way, are quite tasty. They're called tilapia today. The underside of the bowl is painted with a stylized water lily flower. Here's some of the jars found in Mai Her Pri's tomb. During the New Kingdom, oil was stored in jars specially shaped to denote the kind of oil or unguent contained inside. The multicolored small glass vase shown in the center has been stylistically linked to other vessels dated to the reign of Amenhotep II, leading some Egyptologists to speculate that Mai Her Pri may have died during the reign of that king. But similar glassware found in Syria has been dated much earlier. 10 wooden boxes with wrapped joints of meat were found in Mai Her Pri's tomb. Three of these are shown above. Schweinfurth wrote, quote, "Among the offerings of food, such as fruit, grapes, and sycamores, all laid out on finely woven basket plates, there are also pieces of poultry, ox quarters, and the like, all carefully wrapped with fine linen bindings and enclosed in wooden coffins corresponding to their shape." End quote. The bowl below contained pieces of bread lying on sycamore leaves. It had a reed basket lid. The tomb also contained 22 vessels. The 6 jars shown on the right were sealed with linen tops, and each had either an attached label or a painted inscription in hieratic describing the contents inside each jar. The label in this jar says it contained Bach oil made from moringa nuts. Though the 2 of these labeled jars were undamaged, they had not been stolen, perhaps because the oil had become rancid by the time the tomb was raided. Bach oil is usually mixed with other ingredients or used as a topical treatment. It moisturizes dry skin, and it's antibacterial. One ancient Egyptian recipe to reduce wrinkles on the skin was to apply daily a mixture of Bach oil, frankincense gum, wax, and cypress grass finely ground with fermented plant juice, something we probably need today. Schweinfurth said, quote, "On the wall opposite the sarcophagus, 13 large handleless clay jars, the so-called beer tankards, were set up. They were still intact with their seals." End quote. The figures of men brewing beer in the lower right is from the Middle Kingdom tomb of Menkaure, Amenhotep II's chancellor. It was later determined at the Cairo Museum, however, that 10 of these jars held embalming refuge, so only 3 jars were originally filled with beer. The scene on the lower right is from St. Ejem's tomb, showing Anubis, the god of embalming. Right over there. 10 bracelets were found in the tomb. These bracelets are made of blue-gray ceramic, ivory, acacia wood, and beadwork. The bead choker in the far left picture was made of tiny multicolored beads strung on a geometric pattern. And interestingly, the center image from Mai Her Pri's papyrus shows him wearing bracelets and a bead choker. Mai Her Pri's loincloths were found in 1902 by Howard Carter in a small wooden box inscribed with his name. The box was in a hollow of rock just above KV 36, apparently dropped there by tomb robbers. The loincloths are made of oil-tanned goatskin. A man lower right is shown wearing this type of loincloth in a scene from Requeray's tomb, TT 100. The loincloth shown in the upper right is from the Cairo Museum, but the one shown in the lower left was gifted by Theodore Davis to Chicago's Field Museum, where it was stolen shortly after it arrived. Isn't it kind of creepy to steal someone's underpants, ancient or not? Schweinfurth wrote, quote, "Between the sarcophagus and the wall of the burial chamber, there was a box with a game board and all the pieces belonging to it." End quote. This miniature Senate board game is only 6 inches long. It has another playing side on its underside for Jiao, the game of 20 squares, which is now called the Royal Game of Ur. Senate boards have been placed in burials in the since the Middle Kingdom, and they were not only provided an enjoyable pastime, they had a religious significance as well. The game is mentioned in chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead. The game has 30 squares and is thought to have represented the journey of the Ka into the afterlife, avoiding perils and being received into the field of reeds. Senate boards are often shown in tomb scenes. There are many examples of Senate boards and gaming pieces from Egyptian burials. Among the more unusual objects found in Mai Her Pri's tomb are these 2 leather dog collars. Dogs were sometimes shown as pets in tomb scenes, and there are depictions of guard dogs and police dogs. Collar 24075 is inscribed with hunting scenes, and the other collar, 24076, depicts horses, and it's inscribed Tajem, dog, and Peref, of his house, Tanet, which is in Waset, Thebes. At the May 2022 ESS lecture, there was a discussion about the names of dogs in ancient Egypt. I found a paper about ancient Egyptian dogs, and here's a few of the names they mentioned. Rascal, Ebony, Strong Blackie, the Good Watchman, Servant Companion, the Greatest of your pack, the Destroyer. You are lively, you are great, you praise her, Son of the Moon, and here's a weird one. The rudder is at the rear end. Don't know about that one. And perhaps an appropriate name for Mai Her Pri's dog, the one who stays with the Nubian. Graffiti just above Mai Her Pri's tomb shows it was accessible during Ramses II's reign. An additional graffiti higher above the tomb shows it was buried under many feet of rubble by the late 19th dynasty. So it's likely it was robbed in either the late 18th or the early 19th dynasties. Based on later finds from other intact tombs, such as KV46, the tomb of Yuya and Tuya, and TT8, the tomb of Ka and Merit, Mai Her Pri's tomb was missing some of the items that normally would have been placed in his tomb. Things like furniture, a bed and headdress, stools, chairs, and a table, storage boxes, shabtis, clothing, sandals, and linens, bows, and if Mai Her Pri was a military man, a dagger and a shield, metal objects like ewers, jugs, and bronze statues, and perfume. So who was Mai Her Pri? Mai Her Pri tells us he was a child of the Kop and fan bearer to the king. But what else can we determine from his tomb and its contents? He was Nubian, that's clear from his papyrus and his mummy, and he was certainly Egyptianized, that's obvious from his grave goods and his titles. And he must have been a skilled bowman, as arrows, a quiver, and wrist guard were among his burial items. But was he a soldier or just simply a hunter? One Egyptologist has proposed that Mai Her Pri was a hunter, not a soldier, based on another person's translation of this inscription, quote, "Honored before him Seti, the deceased fan-bearer and strong hunter, Mai Her Pri, true of voice," end quote. And he proposed the archery equipment found in Mai Her Pri's tomb were only used for hunting and probably those on expeditions with his king. But when I translated this phrase, I found the throw stick sign, Gardner's T14, is usually the determinative of an omitted word foreign or Nubian, not hunter, which is pronounced nu in ancient Egyptian. So I think the phrase listed above should probably be translated as strong Nubian fan bearer, not strong hunter. But could he have been a hunter anyway? Among Mai Her Pri's arrows was one that did not have a sharp point. Schweinfurth said, quote, "Attached to one of the arrowheads is a club-shaped pebble, which may have served to stun small animals he wished to keep alive," end quote. So that particular type of arrow may be evidence that his bows and arrows were intended for hunting. This type of arrow is called a bumper arrow, and it's normally used for hunting birds. But also, I think it's possible that Mai Her Pri's bows and arrows were intended for hunting, but only in the afterlife. Now let's take a closer look at Nubia. Although some sources claim the name for Nubia was derived from the Egyptian word nebu, meaning gold, linguists don't think this is true. In the Old and Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian referred to the land south of Egypt as Taseti, literally the land of the bowmen. The part of Nubia between the first and second cataract, that's northern Nubia, was called Wawat. And south of the second cataract, Nubia was called Kush. Wawat was ruled from Kerma by the Kushites during the Second Intermediate Period. Early New Kingdom pharaohs recaptured Wawat and slowly pushed their way into Kushite territory, fighting in a number of skirmishes. Thutmose III finally defeated the Kushites and pushed past Kerma to rule Nubia as far as the Fourth Cataract. By the New Kingdom, Egyptians began to refer the whole area south of the First Cataract as Kush. Part of the reason for this conquest, of course, was to control the many gold mines in Nubia. In fact, Nubia produced most of Egypt's gold up through the reign of Thutmose III. The modern term for the Egyptian governor to the land south of the First Cataract, the so-called Viceroy of Kush, was actually Sa Nesut Kush, or King's son of Kush, whether or not the Viceroy was actually related to the king. The Egyptians referred to two kinds of people in Nubia: the Medjay, seasonal hunters who lived in the Nubian desert east of the Nile, and the Nahesi, those who practiced agriculture and lived along the Nile Valley in Nubia. The Medjay were a semi-nomadic culture of herders and warriors. The right-hand picture is a painted cattle skull found in a Nubian Medjay grave. It shows a warrior whose Egyptianized name, Keska'ant, is spelled out in hieroglyphs. The Medjay were expert bowmen, perhaps because they regularly hunted game with bows and arrows. And beginning in the Middle Kingdom, these archers began to be employed in the Egyptian army. They were highly skilled, and by the New Kingdom, so many Medjay were in the domestic police that the words for police, Shena, and Medjay became interchangeable. If Mai Her Pri wasn't a hunter, was he a warrior, perhaps commanding a group of Medjay bowmen in the Egyptian army? On his papyrus, he states he is, and I quote, "one who followed the king in his marches to the northern and southern foreign countries." This, with his name Lion on the battlefield, sure does hint that he may have been a military soldier. Next, let's examine who Mai Her Pri's parents might have been. There does not seem to be much agreement about Mai Her Pri's origins and when he was born or when he died. So, being an engineer, I created a handful of flowcharts on all the options I found. As I mentioned previously, he could have been born in Nubia. If he was born in Nubia, it's possible he was a foreign prince sent to be raised in Egypt. Both Thutmose II and III had military campaigns in Nubia, and from an inscription at Aswan, we learn a Nubian chief's son was said to be raised in Egypt. Mai Her Pri's inscription seemed to refer to himself as a foreign bowman. The Nubian chief mentioned in the Aswan stela inscription was not named. To foster loyalty to Egypt, a Nubian king's child could have been raised in the Kop, along with the royal and noble children. As a child of the Kop, Mai Her Pri may have grown up with the future king and the next generation of his nobles. Or perhaps Mai Her Pri was born in Egypt, the son of an Egyptian noble, or a Nubian noble living in Egypt. Mai Her Pri's father could have been an Egyptian noble with a Nubian wife, or a Nubian noble living in Egypt with either an Egyptian or a Nubian wife, who was perhaps the commander of a troop of Medjay. Or Mai Her Pri's father might have been the son of an important Nubian noble living in Egyptian territory, like Hekenefer, the governor of Miam and Wawat, about 30 miles north of Abu Simbel. Hekenefer was an Egyptianized Nubian who lived during Tutankhamun's reign. In the tomb of Hui, viceroy of Nubia, Hekenefer is depicted of mixed race, and he's described as a child of the Kop. A DNA test on Mai Her Pri's mummy should be able to confirm if he was 100% Nubian or of mixed Nubian and Egyptian origin. But unfortunately, the mummy has not been tested yet. Or finally, Mai Her Pri could have been a pharaoh's son, either through a Nubian wife or a Nubian concubine, who the Egyptians referred to as the king's ornament. Egyptologist Orsenego does not think Mai Her Pri was the son of an Egyptian king. He wrote in an article in French, quote, "In the inscriptions of his funerary objects, Mai Her Pri is never evoked as the son of a king, Sa Nasut. This absence leads me to exclude that he could have been the son of a sovereign and one of his foreign wives," end quote. But if Mai Her Pri's mother was the king's concubine, however, perhaps as a love child, he did not claim to be the legitimate son of the king. For now, however, let's assume Mai Her Pri was the son of an Egyptian king and a Nubian wife. Thutmose II's only known wives were Hatshepsut and Iset, and neither are believed to have been Nubian. And Thutmose III had at least 3 foreign wives, and again, none of them are known to be Nubian. No matter who Mai Her Pri's parents were, who was Mai Her Pri's pharaoh as he grew up? All of these kings have been proposed as candidates. We do know Mai Her Pri grew up in the Kop, but was it with a child destined to be the future king? And if so, which king was it? Or was Mai Her Pri raised in the Kop during the long reign of an adult king? If this were the case, there's only 2 candidate kings with a long enough reign, Thutmose III at 54 years and Amenhotep II, who ruled for 27 years. Since Mai Her Pri recorded he accompanied his king outside of Egypt to both the north and south, here's the foreign campaigns of his possible kings. As I'll explain in the next few slides, Thutmose II, Hatshepsut, and Amenhotep III did not lead their troops both to the north and south of Egypt. This makes it more likely that Mai Her Pri's king was either Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, or Thutmose IV. So let's investigate each of these kings in a little more detail. Thutmose II married his royal half-sister Hatshepsut at an early age. Their daughter, Neferure, seems to have been born around 1485 BCE. She was the only surviving child of Hatshepsut and Thutmose II. In addition to marrying Hatshepsut, Thutmose II also married Iset, who became a secondary wife, and she had a son named Thutmose III. Here's the Aswan inscription of Treasurer T, dated to regnal year 1 of Thutmose II. Quote, "Then His Majesty dispatched a numerous army into Nubia on his first occasion of a campaign in order to overthrow all those who were hostile to the Lord of the 2 lands. This army of His Majesty arrived at the wretched Cush and overthrew those barbarians. They did not let anyone live among their males, except those of children of the chief of the wretched Cush, who were taken away alive as living prisoners." End quote. Mai Her Pri was probably too young to have participated in this campaign, but he could have been the Nubian chief's son brought back to Egypt. Most people know the story of Hatshepsut's rise to power. For the first 7 years, she acted as regent for her nephew, but then in year 7, when Thutmose III was 9 years old, Hatshepsut declared herself co-king and portrayed herself as a male pharaoh. She lived for the next 15 years, during which time Thutmose III was educated and eventually given control of Egypt's army. Hatshepsut died in the regnal year 22, after which Thutmose III was the sole ruler for the next 30 years. Donald Redford says, quote, "Taking the Aswan graffito in conjunction with other scattered phrases at Deir el-Bahri in Senenmut's tomb, and on General Jehudi's stela, there was indeed a war during Hatshepsut's time in the south, and the queen herself was actually at the scene of the hostilities, end quote. In his book, Thutmose III, Richard Gabriel says that this battle occurred late in Hatshepsut's reign, so Thutmose III would have been in charge of the army, since he was given command at 16 years of age, 6 years before Hatshepsut died. Gabriel also wrote that Hatshepsut sent the army into Nubia at least 4 times during her reign. So it's possible that Mai Her Pri accompanied either Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, or both on one or more of these Nubian campaigns. But what about those expeditions to the north? If Mai Her Pri was born about the same time as Thutmose III and grew up in the Kop with him, he may have accompanied Thutmose III on his early campaigns to the Levant. In year 23 of Thutmose III's reign, a year after Hatshepsut died, he became sole ruler. Thutmose led his army north into the Levant to fight the Battle of Megiddo. He would return to this area every year as a show of force to put down rebellions for the next 10 years. Between years 22 and 54, Thutmose was on 17 military campaigns to preserve Egypt's empire. But could Mai Her Pri actually have been Thutmose III's son? In this unfinished scene from Thutmose III's tomb, in the upper register, Thutmose stands in front of his mother Iset. In the lower register, Thutmose is shown nursing at the Tree of Life, leading a procession of 2 of his wives, Merietre and Sitia, and his consort, Neb II. Now, Neb II, by the way, is the plural of Nebet, which means mistress or concubine, that is, the king's ornament. And behind her is Thutmose's daughter, Nefertiru. Was Thutmose III's concubine Neb II a Nubian? Could she have been Mai Her Pri's mother? It's just a thought. Catherine Roehrig believes that Mai Her Pri was buried sometimes between the time Hatshepsut died in regnal year 22 and Thutmose III's purge of her name and images sometime around his regnal year 47. Christian Orsonego believes the purge was around Thutmose III's year 42, and Constantine Lacomi believes it was later, around Thutmose III's year 50 or 51. One of Mai Her Pri's mummy bandages was stamped with Ma Ka Re, the throne name of Queen Hatshepsut, used after she assumed kingship in year 7 of her joint reign with Thutmose III. When I used Photoshop to enhance one of the original pictures on the mummy bandage, I noticed a watermark-like inscription showing the text Iwinti, bowman, just above Hatshepsut's cartouche. Does this imply Mai Her Pri was a bowman during Hatshepsut's joint reign with Thutmose III? You know, I think it does. Mai Her Pri may have died later during the sole reign of Thutmose III before Hatshepsut's name was purged, about 25 years after her death. This is the theory favored by Catherine Roehrig. After that date, Mai Her Pri probably would not have been wrapped in a bandage bearing Hatshepsut's name. Some Egyptologists have proposed Mai Her Pri died even later, and that the embalmers recycled one of Hatshepsut's old bandages. Their theory is based on the later style of some of Mai Her Pri's grave goods, and if true, Mai Her Pri may have grown up in the Kop with Thutmose III's son, Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II was 18 years old when he became co-ruler with his father, Thutmose III. He co-ruled with him for 2 years and then became sole ruler between 1425 and 1400 BCE. Amenhotep II conducted 3 campaigns in Asia, regnal years 2, 7, and 9. In year 3, he headed south into Nubia, and he subdued an uprising and captured 7 princes. 1 he hung upside down on the wall at Napata. The other 6 he brought back to Egypt, hanging them face downwards on the prows of his ships, and eventually draping them on the wall at Karnak. Nice guy, huh? Assuming Mai Her Pri was born about the same time, he would have been old enough to have participated in both of Amenhotep II's Asian and Nubian campaigns. After Amenhotep's Nubian campaign, Nubia seems to have been peaceful for the remainder of his reign. On a stela of Usersetet, Amenhotep II's viceroy in Nubia, there are scenes of a Durbar ceremony with Nubians presenting tribute. Amenhotep II built and completed several forts and temples in Nubia during his reign: Quasir Ibram, Semna, Kalabsha, and Amada. Or could Mai Her Pri have been born even later, about the same time as Amenhotep III's son, Thutmose IV, and grew up in the Kop with him? Thutmose IV was born about 1420 BCE. In the dream stela left in front of the Sphinx, Thutmose IV tells us that although he was not the crown prince, in a dream he was told if he cleared the sand away from the half-buried Sphinx and venerated the beast, the god Ra-Harmekti would make him the next king. And Egyptologists, as we know, call this a justification speech, told to legitimize his claim to the throne. So who knows what might have happened to his older brothers. There was a campaign in Nubia in regnal year 8 and at least 2 excursions into Syria, but these appear to have been policing forays into his vassal states rather than military attacks. But Mai Her Pri could have accompanied Thutmose IV on these ventures outside of Egypt. The last pharaoh some Egyptologists have suggested was Mai Her Pri's king is Thutmose IV's son, Amenhotep III. The situation in Syria during Amenhotep III's reign appears to have been peaceful, but he did put down a campaign in Nubia in year 5, capturing 740 prisoners and slaying 312 rebels. Since Amenhotep III did not campaign in Syria during his reign, it makes it less likely he was Mai Her Pri's king, since there was no expedition by this king to the north. One theory proposed is that Mai Her Pri lived during the reign of Amenhotep III based on the similarity of the sarcophagi and coffins found in 1905 in KV 46, the tomb of Yuya and Tuya. Donald Redford estimated that Yuya died during Amenhotep III's 12th or 13th regnal year. Yuya and Tuya were also granted a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, no doubt because they were parents of Amenhotep III's wife, Ti. Now, only 70 years elapsed between Hatshepsut and Yuya's burial, so it's possible no matter when Mai Her Pri died, the same workshop constructed both Mai Her Pri and Yuya's burial goods, especially with the tradition of father-to-son apprenticeships are taken into account. Similar coffins does not necessarily mean they died at exactly the same time. And although some of Mai Her Pri and Yuya's grave goods are similar, some of Mai Her Pri's artifacts seem to be of an earlier form. So the real question is, how much earlier? So that's the $64,000 question. So which king was ruling when Mai Her Pri died? There's not much agreement on this among Egyptologists. There isn't enough time for a detailed discussion for each king, but using the information I just presented, I think we can make an educated guess of which pharaoh was ruling when Mai Her Pri died. The placement of Mai Her Pri's tomb near those of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II makes it more likely he was associated with them. Thutmose IV's tomb is some distance away in another wadi in the valley, and the tomb of Amenhotep III is in another valley altogether, so it's less likely he died during their reigns. For several reasons, I believe we can eliminate that Mai Her Pri died during the reign of Thutmose II, Hatshepsut, or Amenhotep III. So that only leaves Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV as candidates. Statistically, just based on the span of years of each king's reign, there's about a 60% probability that Mai Her Pri died during the rule of Thutmose III, a 30% probability he died during the reign of Amenhotep II, and only a 10% probability it was during the reign of Thutmose IV. So I think it is likely that Mai Her Pri grew up in the Kop with Thutmose III, fought with him in his Nubian and Syrian wars, earning him the nickname Lion on the battlefield, perhaps as a commander of Medjay troops. But that's just my speculation. If he wasn't Thutmose III's son, then who was he? Mai Her Pri may have been a foreign prince, a noble's son, or even the son of another Thutmosid king. DNA testing would help sort this out. If he was 100% Nubian, he was either a Nubian prince sent to Egypt or the son of a Nubian noble and his Nubian wife living in Egypt. If he were half Egyptian, he still might have been the son of a noble with either a Nubian husband or wife. If he was the son of one of the kings previously mentioned, Mai Her Pri's DNA could be compared to each of them to find out which king was his father. So more testing is needed. To conclude, let's consider Mai Her Pri's journey into the afterlife. His 39-foot-long papyrus scroll, called Medjad in ancient Egypt, is on display at the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. In a vignette from Mai Her Pri's papyrus, his mummy is being dragged to his tomb in the valley by 4 men and an oxen. This vignette, text from Mai Her Pri's papyrus, shows spell 126 from the Book of the Dead, where baboons who ride in the bark of Re sit around a lake of fire with flaming braziers between them, and the baboons call out to the deceased, quote, "Come, so we may expel your evil and get a hold of your falsehoods, and dispel the evil which was with you on earth. Enter into the other world, pass by the secret portals of the west, and you shall be given a cake, a jug of beer, and a loaf of bread. You shall then go in and out at your desire, just like those favored spirits who are summoned daily into the horizon," end quote. Mai Her Pri's version of spell 125 of the Book of the Dead contains the 42 negative confessions, which must be made in front of a panel of gods. Mai Her Pri addresses the gods, and I quote, "Danger One, who came forth from the underworld, I have not killed men. Swallower of shades, who came forth from the cavern, I have not stolen. Bone breaker, who came forth from Heracleopolis, I have not told lies. Nefertem, who came forth from Memphis, I have done no wrong, I have seen no evil. And there's 38 more negative confessions, end quote. On the papyrus of Ani at the British Museum, the deceased's heart is weighed against the feather of truth while making his negative confessions in front of the panel of gods. This judgment is recorded by the scribal god Thoth and eagerly watched by the devourer Ammit, who stands ready to eat the soul of those who fail the test. Here's Mai Her Pri's version of the previous scene, showing him in front of Osiris sitting on the scale, balancing his heart. The weighing is watched by Thoth, who's shown in the form of a baboon. Mai Her Pri's vignette is depicted next to spell 138, the spell for entering into Abydos and meeting Osiris. In the right-hand view, Mai Her Pri's boss spirit is watching the outcome of the trial. According to the Book of Gates, after the deceased is judged fit to enter the afterlife, he must sail downriver through a series of gates. There's one for each hour of the night, where hazards await, various spells must be uttered, and the secret name of the gate guardian spoken. The first gate is guarded by a snake called Saset, the desert protector. Here, Mai Her Pri holds the serpent at bay with a forked stick. The forked stick should look familiar, as it's the basis of the wasp's scepter, the animal-headed stick that was a symbol of power. The Book of the Gates was derived from the Book of Two Ways, part of the Middle Kingdom coffin texts. And of course, Mai Her Pri would eventually pass through the last gate and reach the Amduat, the netherworld, where various parts of his soul would be rejoined, and he would live in the Field of Reeds happily ever after. The Field of Reeds was first described in the Book of the Heavenly Cows, the oldest known copy, which comes from the First Intermediate period. This vignette shows Mai Her Pri praising the 7 celestial cows and the bull of heaven, illustrating the Book of the Dead spell 148. It says in part, and quote, "May you grant bread and beer and provisions which shall provide for my spirit, for I am a worthy spirit who is now in the land of the dead," end quote. Like the priest offering to Mai Her Pri in this scene, by speaking his name, we are helping to preserve his memory and pay tribute to him in his afterlife. Hope you've enjoyed learning about this fascinating individual who was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I have 2 references if you'd like more information on them. Kemet, which is volume 28, and a book by Dennis Forbes called Tombs, Treasures, and Mummies, Tomb of Mai Her Pri. So they're very good if you want more detailed information that I could cover in 1 hour. So, any questions?
All right, we do have a question. Dennis asks, what is the purpose of barley in the coffin?
Same reason. It's the resurrection. So barley seeds were part of the Osiris ritual that when watered and they started to sprout, it showed that resurrection was possible from something that's quote unquote dead. So that was the reason that they put bundles of barley in the tomb to be planted in the netherworld and resurrected into growing crops.
Okay, and then Dennis also asks, I have not heard of the 7 celestial cows. What is their significance?
Again, that goes way back in time to earlier books in the coffin text. And the significance basically is there are, how would I phrase this? There are rituals and spells that have to be said in front of these cows. And it's part of that entire litany, I suppose, of Hathor, the cow goddess. It's the manifestation of the physical cows versus the magical cows that Hathor represents. I guess you could call it talking to the animals.
The Osiris bed. I'd never heard of that, and
Couldn't either.
Was it kind of like a chia pet? I mean, just...
No. There was one in Tut's tomb as well. I mean, they're not common, but there are a few been found. Yes, Bill.
On that fact that you said that was the first one discovered.
Right.
I mean, that was the oldest one they have found, or?
Since it was phrased that way, I assume not. I assume that there has been discoveries of at least remains of Osiris beds in earlier tombs, because this was 18th dynasty reign of Hatshepsut approximately. So there may have been earlier ones found, such as the Middle Kingdom. I'm not sure, but that was the exact wording within Swinefirth's comments. So I assume he knew what he was talking about. I'm not aware of any earlier ones, though.
Okay. And
That's
then
probably
Dennis,
one of one of the most complete ones, though, that they found.
And then Dennis also asked, I had not realized the Egyptians used poisoned arrows. Was this something they always did, or was it just certain troops or certain eras?
I don't know the answer to that. The paper I found on Egyptian arrows was pretty specific that this was a Nubian thing, and it was one of the Medjay's things. So again, as I mentioned, this might be the reason that Nubian archers were so feared, was in fact they were poisoning their arrows and other people weren't. I don't know. Do you know, Bill? In the ancient world, there were germ warfare and there was poisons and there were other things that they don't talk about a lot. But it was a tool.
And were the Medjay, were they the same ones that were hired in Egypt to be like police?
Yes. It started in the Middle Kingdom. The Medjay were brought into the Egyptian army, and whole squadrons of them became archers in the Egyptian army, mercenary archers, if you like. And they became so accepted that, Nubians in around the southern part of Egypt, in Luxor area, were pretty much accepted. And, it wasn't this racial issue thing as much as admiring their skills. So there were entire units that were in there, probably because they spoke a different language than the Egyptians. So a commander would keep that unit together because they used similar techniques. They spoke the same language, etc. So it'd be good to have a crack set of Nubian Medjay troops in your army as archers. Pretty sophisticated bows too. They used composite bows as well. So this technology was pretty advanced. I was surprised at the arrows. I knew nothing that composite arrows go that far back. And one of the reasons is wood being fairly scarce is you'll use like about a 6-inch tip of hardwood, mount your tip of your arrow point on the hardwood, and then you use a lightweight, easily common reed shaft of about 15-20 inches. That way the arrow weighs less, it flies farther, and the hardwood point will go into somebody with the arrow tip, and you're not really having to have giant long 32-inch arrows. The Native Americans I found that was interesting when I was reading that. The Native Americans had composite arrows on both coasts where reeds grew, and they did that as well. But the Plains Indians had just plain wooden arrows because there weren't fields of reeds to use for doubling up your arrow. So more research needed on that, I think. Actually, it's David. I have a question for Bill. Do you know?
We're just popcorning here tonight. I love this.
Do you know? Is there any strategic plan of moving the things to the new gem museum, other than just putting all the Tut stuff there?
They are being so quiet about what's going on. There's nothing but rumors running around, and I know nothing of any specific plans. Nothing's been announced.
Are we any closer to a November opening? Do you know, or?
Nothing's been announced. They keep saying that 98% of the stuff has been moved, but the really good stuff has to go. And my own suspicion is that they're going to move it in the latter part of the summer during the lowest tourist season, so that it's on display somewhere as much as possible. So I still think there's a chance they'll open the museum in early November, but in Egypt, nothing happens till it happens.
You think with the Tut anniversary, though, this is a golden opportunity. So. Thank you.
I was going to say, are they moving everything out of the Cairo Museum? Is it going to be an empty hole?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The new museum is going to have a focus. The primary focus, of course, is going to be the Tut exhibit, because they're going to display, they say, everything that came out of King Tut's tomb.
5,000 objects.
Yeah, a lot. And so that's going to be the main thing. And that's, of course, some of the colossal statues that they've already moved there. But the Egyptian Museum is still going to be a major museum.
Okay. Are they going to update it at all and redo the cases and stuff like that to protect things?
I know they're moving an awful lot of things around to fill up the spaces. So that it doesn't look empty, and it doesn't. I mean, if you were a person who's never been to Egypt and you went to the Egyptian Museum, you would not really notice anything amiss.
Well,
I was going to say, it was packed to the gills before, wasn't it?
Oh yeah.
Maybe they'll clean the glass.
And it's not packed to the gills now, but still,
Very
every
full.
hallway has exhibits in it so that it's, if you haven't been there before, as I said, you really wouldn't notice that things are missing.
So the interesting thing, I think, in when I was looking at this was those JDE, journal to entry numbers that came back from the Giza Museum. Just kind of shows how they don't have a whole lot of control over what's in those cases because they don't even have the right numbers on the items. So you can see why when there was some objects during the revolution that disappeared from the museum, they wanted photographs of the cases from people that had been there to see what was in those cases when they found an empty case in the middle of the museum. So the records are pretty sketchy, I think. So
does the Egyptian Museum have a lot of material in storage that they can now bring out into the space vacated?
yes.
If they choose to, absolutely.
It's Dick Harwood, and thank you very much, David. That was very, very interesting. I had to leave the room for a minute, came back, and you were talking about arrows. I had a question with regard to the joints. You were pointing out the two different main joints of an arrow. We know, of course, that the arrows were reused. What did they use to make the joints and make them stay together so that they didn't come apart when an animal was shot?
They basically glued them together. They had like a point, like a wooden arrow has a point. They had a point like that fit into a hollowed out area of the hard wood. So the reed was pointed and then shoved into that, kind of like sticking a needle into something. And then it was glued together and then it was wrapped with twine dipped and grew around the joint to strengthen it. So I imagine that the joint was probably stronger than the reed part of the arrow. It would not probably be something that you couldn't reuse. They said, though, the feathers were fairly fragile, so don't know whether they stayed well or not. And the odd thing is they don't have arrowheads that come to a point in the center. They have flat arrowheads that are like a razor blade stuck on the end of the arrow. So I found that interesting that they have these microliths. They sharpen like a razor blade rather than a point. I don't know, maybe it does more damage when you hit somebody with one of those. A larger wound.
It would definitely take skill to nail something that doesn't have a point like that. But yeah, the fletching is usually the most fragile part of the arrows. That's the part you frequently are having to replace the most. So
somebody talked about the distances too, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but a composite bow with these composite arrows are capable of a very long distance, like 450 feet or something. So you can hit somebody from pretty far away with an arrow.
My grandfather used to teach hunter safety, and we had a very shocking video for all the people that are gun enthusiasts at the power of an arrow compared to the power of a rifle. So yes, they're very powerful creatures, that's for sure. All right. Does anybody else have a question?
Just read an article on the Mongolians and their composite arrows, bows would fire arrows about 350 yards, up to 350 yards.
Yeah, Mongolian bows are really cool. The shape of them is very, very unique because most of them were fired off of horseback, which if you think about galloping full speed on a horse and managing a longbow, it's pretty impressive stuff.
David, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.